Silent Pulse by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1: The MRI Appointment. Emily Foster glanced at the clock on her dashboard as she pulled into the hospital parking lot. 10:45 a.m. Right on time. Her migraines had started 3 months ago. Sharp, blinding bursts of pain that left her fumbling for relief. Though her GP reassured her an MRI was necessary to rule out anything serious. The NHS hospital loomed in drab shades of concrete and glass. Emily parked, grabbed her bag, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The leaves, a tapestry of ochre and crimson, rustled faintly in the breeze, a serene contrast to her growing unease. Inside, the reception buzzed with its usual activity. Patients occupied plastic chairs, clutching appointment slips or scrolling their phones. The faint smell of disinfectant lingered. Emily approached the desk, her shoes tapping softly against the tiled floor. "Name?" the receptionist asked, typing without looking up. "Emily Foster, MRI at 11. Radiology, down the hall, third door on your left." Emily followed the directions. Radiology was quieter, the hum of machines audible even from the hallway. A kind-eyed technician greeted her. "Emily Foster? Right on time. Let's get you prepped." Emily's nerves frayed as she lay on the scanner bed, the machine's gleaming white cylinder looming over her. The technician handed her foam earplugs. "It'll be noisy, but that's normal. Stay as still as you can. The scan should take 20 minutes. The machine whirred to life with loud, rhythmic thuds. Emily closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing. Thoughts of groceries and her upcoming presentation flitted through her mind. Then it happened. A low hum vibrated through her body, different from the machine's noise. Subtle at first, it grew stronger, resonating in her chest. Her fingers twitched involuntarily as a tingling sensation spread through her limbs. Panic surged. She tried to call out, but her voice failed. The machine stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Emily opened her eyes to dim red light inside the scanner. The air felt thick. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing faintly. No response. Sliding herself out of the machine, she found the room empty. The technician's chair was pushed back as if he'd left in a hurry. "Hello?" she repeated, louder. Still nothing. Stepping into the hallway, her unease deepened. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting uneven shadows. Papers lay scattered at the reception desk, and the monitor displayed a blank blue screen. The familiar hum of machines was gone. The main reception area was deserted. A half-full coffee cup sat on the counter, steam still rising. Emily grabbed her phone. No signal. The error message read, "No network available." Outside, the parking lot was eerily silent. Cars sat idle, some with doors ajar. One engine hummed faintly, but no driver was in sight. A newspaper fluttered across the ground. The headline was blurred. Emily's chest tightened as she turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty streets. Not a single person in sight. No movement, no sound, just a suffocating, oppressive quiet. She was utterly alone. Chapter 2: The Empty World. Emily's breaths came shallow and quick as she stood on the hospital steps, staring at the desolate world before her. The stillness was absolute. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic. It was as though the world had simply stopped. She descended the steps cautiously, her sneakers crunching on the gravel. The hum of the still-running car in the parking lot drew her attention. She approached it, her distorted reflection glinting off the glossy surface. The engine purred steadily, keys dangling in the ignition, but the driver's seat was empty. A half-empty energy drink sat in the cup holder, condensation clinging to its surface. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. Only silence answered. Emily resisted the panic clawing at her chest. Think logically. A gas leak? A sudden evacuation? But if that were true, why had no one come for her? Why had no alarm sounded? Grabbing her phone, she tried dialing her mom's number. The call failed instantly. She tried another, then another, with the same result. Frustration mounted as she leaned against the car, its warmth oddly reassuring in the frigid air. Determined to find answers, Emily returned to the hospital. The automatic doors opened with a whir, startlingly loud in the quiet. Inside, the reception desk looked untouched. A computer monitor glowed faintly, papers scattered haphazardly. Emily picked up the phone on the desk and pressed it to her ear. No dial tone. She slammed it down, the sharp sound echoing unnaturally. Gritting her teeth, she moved methodically through the building, checking rooms and corridors. The wards were pristine, beds neatly made, ivy stands poised like silent sentinels. A meal tray in one room held a still steaming cup of tea and a half-eaten sandwich. The sight made her stomach churn. It was as if the occupants had vanished mid-action. As she explored deeper, an unsettling sensation crept over her, the feeling of being watched. She spun around, her heart pounding, but the corridor behind her was empty. The fluorescent lights flickered, their hum seeming louder than before. "Hello?" she called again, her voice breaking. It echoed back mockingly. In the staff break room, a bulletin board caught her eye. Among the memos and reminders was an evacuation procedure. She scanned it eagerly but found nothing unusual. Frustration bubbled over, and she sank into a chair. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning supplies, grounding her in its mundane familiarity. Her gaze fell on the wall clock. The second hand ticked steadily, but the time, 11:32 a.m., remained unchanged. She pulled out her phone. The display read the same. A faint clattering noise broke the silence, jolting her upright. It sounded like something metallic hitting the floor. Emily froze, straining to hear. The noise had come from the corridor. "Hello?" she whispered, inching toward the sound. The clattering stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. Her steps felt impossibly loud as she crept forward. Around the corner, a metal tray lay on the floor, spinning faintly before settling. Emily's breath caught. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Out of the corner of her eye, a shadow flickered. She turned sharply, but the hallway was empty. She wasn't alone after all. Chapter 3. The Shadow Lurks. Emily's breath quickened as she stared down the empty corridor. The shadow she glimpsed, a fleeting dark blur, played tricks on her mind. "It's nothing," she told herself, though a deep unease rooted her in place. The silence pressed against her. A squeak echoed as she took a hesitant step forward, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. Her eyes remained locked on the corner where the shadow had vanished. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer, only the flickering of fluorescent lights and her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She edged toward the corner, keeping close to the wall. Her breaths came shallow, each step heavier than the last. As she peered around the corner, her body tensed. Nothing, just another stretch of dimly lit hallway. Relief and frustration swirled inside her. "Get a grip, Emily," she muttered, but the gnawing sensation of being watched refused to fade. She turned and walked briskly back toward the main reception, deciding it was safer to stay near the familiar. Halfway there, a sound stopped her cold, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It came from behind her, deliberate and steady. Emily froze, straining to listen. The tapping grew louder, sharper, and closer. She spun around. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure. It was indistinct, wreathed in shadow, its edges wavering like smoke. It stood perfectly still, as though observing her. Emily's heart raced as a cold fear took hold. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice cracking. "What's going on?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It simply stood there, a dark silhouette against the pale light. Then, without warning, it began to glide forward, not walk, but move unnaturally smooth as if it floated above the ground. Panic seized her. She turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the tiled floor as the tapping behind her quickened. The main reception loomed ahead. Bursting through the doors, she skidded to a stop, her chest heaving. Her eyes darted toward the entrance doors. She lunged for them, slamming her hands against the push bar. They didn't budge. "No, no, no," she gasped, frantically pushing and pulling. The doors remained locked. She turned back, her back pressed against the glass. The corridor she had just fled was empty. The tapping had stopped. The figure was gone. Tears blurred her vision as she slid to the floor, trembling. The oppressive silence returned, thicker than ever. Then came a whisper. Faint at first, it grew louder, insistent, and unmistakable. "Emily, Emily, Emily." Chapter 4, The Echoing Whisper. Emily sat frozen on the cold floor, her back pressed against the locked doors. The whispering of her name continued, soft but pervasive, like a breath carried on the wind. It echoed through the empty reception area, making her skin crawl. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice breaking. The whisper didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, each repetition of her name sounding closer, more intimate, as though someone were leaning in to murmur directly into her ear. Spinning around, Emily searched the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their sterile glow revealing nothing but empty chairs and scattered papers. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her trembling hands. "I'm not playing games," she shouted, the sound ricocheting off the walls. Suddenly the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing against her chest like a weight. Then, as if guided by an unseen force, her gaze was drawn back to the corridor. Something compelled her to return. "No, stay here," she told herself. But curiosity mixed with dread, pulling at her like an invisible thread. Slowly, she stood, wiping her damp palms on her jeans. Each step toward the corridor felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted her movement. When she reached the corner, she stopped. The metal tray still lay on the floor where she'd seen it earlier, its surface dull under the flickering light. She stepped over it cautiously, her breath hitching with every creak of her sneakers against the tile. A faint sound broke the stillness, a soft scraping, like fingernails dragging across metal. Emily's stomach twisted. The noise came from further down the corridor. Her muscles tensed as she moved forward, one hand pressed against the wall for balance. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The scraping stopped. Ahead, one of the doors stood slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness spilled out into the hallway. The sight made her heart race, but her feet refused to obey the instinct to turn and flee. Instead, she moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. Pushing it open, she peered inside. The room was dim, the light flickering weakly as though struggling to stay alive. The surgical table in the center gleamed faintly, its surface smeared with a dark, viscous substance. Scattered instruments littered the floor, their sharp edges catching the feeble light. "Is anyone here?" she whispered, her voice cracking. In the far corner of the room, a shadow shifted. Emily froze, her breath catching. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, but then it began to grow, spreading across the walls like ink spilled in water. It coalesced into a form, humanoid but grotesque, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements fluid and alien. It had no face, yet Emily felt its gaze pierce through her. Paralyzed by terror, she could only stare as the shadow stretched toward her, its edges curling like smoke. A scream finally tore from her throat. Turning, she bolted down the hallway, her sneakers skidding on the slick tiles. The hospital twisted and turned around her like a labyrinth, the corridors endless and unfamiliar. Doors slammed shut behind her as she ran, the sound echoing like gunfire. Her lungs burned as she pushed through a set of heavy double doors, bursting into a stairwell. She stumbled down the steps, gripping the railing to keep from falling. When she reached the ground floor, she shoved open the fire exit, spilling into the cold night air. The world outside offered no comfort. The streets were empty, the buildings lifeless. A bitter wind bit at her cheeks as she leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. Then she saw it. Across the street, standing under a flickering street lamp, was the shadow. Its form rippled like smoke caught in a breeze. Though it had no eyes, she felt its gaze lock onto her. "Leave me alone!" She screamed, her voice hoarse. The shadow didn't move, but the light around it began to dim. The glow of the street lamp shrank until it was swallowed entirely. Darkness spilled across the pavement, creeping toward her like a living thing. Emily turned and ran again, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. The streets twisted and stretched, unfamiliar and unending. Her surroundings blurred as panic clouded her vision. Finally, her legs gave out, and she collapsed in the middle of an intersection. The world around her was eerily quiet, save for her ragged breathing. She glanced around desperately, searching for any sign of life, any escape. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. They weren't just saying her name anymore. They were fragments of sentences, words she couldn't piece together. The sound clawed at her sanity, pulling her deeper into despair. Amid the chaos, one voice cut through clearly. "Emily, wake up." The world shattered like glass, plunging her into darkness. Chapter 5: The Fractured Reality. Emily awoke lying on a cold, smooth surface. Darkness enveloped her, pressing against her like a weight. Her breathing was shallow, the metallic tang of the air clinging to her tongue. Trembling, she sat up, her hands searching blindly for something familiar. The floor beneath her was glass-like, seamless and alien. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the void. In the distance, a pinprick of light appeared. It grew steadily brighter, piercing the darkness with its clinical, sharp intensity. Emily shielded her eyes as the light expanded, revealing her surroundings. The space was vast and featureless, stretching endlessly in every direction. The floor shimmered faintly, as though it were alive. Far away, vague shapes flickered, their forms indistinct and fleeting. A low hum broke the silence, rhythmic and resonant, vibrating through her bones. The shapes in the distance became clearer, coalescing into tall, angular structures that seemed to twist and shift with every glance. "What is this place?" Emily asked aloud, her voice quivering. "This is the in-between," a voice replied. Emily spun around, her heart lurching. Standing behind her was a figure she recognized, the shadowy, humanoid form from the hospital. But here, its edges were sharper, its form more defined, though its face remained a blank void. "Who are you?" she demanded, taking a step back. The figure tilted its head as though considering her question. "I am a fragment of the balance you disrupted." "I don't understand," Emily shouted, frustration breaking through her fear. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't." "You chose," the figure interrupted, its tone calm yet unyielding. "And now you must restore what was broken." Emily's knees buckled under the weight of its words. "Restore? How? I don't even know what's happening." The figure gestured toward the shifting structures in the distance. "The fracture you created has spread. Realities are colliding. Boundaries are dissolving. If left unchecked, all will be consumed." Emily followed its gesture, her eyes locking onto the surreal skyline. The angular towers rippled with an energy that made her skin crawl. Within their shifting forms, she glimpsed other places: forests, cities, oceans, fragments of worlds bleeding into one another. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, barely audible. The figure extended a hand, and Emily noticed a small, glowing orb hovering above its palm. The orb pulsed with the same eerie blue light she had seen in the hospital scanner. "Take this," the figure said. "It is a key, a remnant of the balance. Use it to seal the fracture." Emily hesitated, her gaze fixed on the orb. Its glow was mesmerizing, but it radiated a dangerous energy, like holding a live wire. "And if I don't?" The figure darkened, its form fraying at the edges. "Then your world, and all others, will fall into chaos." A chill ran down Emily's spine. The weight of the decision pressed on her chest, but deep down, she knew there was no choice. With trembling hands, she reached out and grasped the orb. Its warmth spread through her fingers, flowing into her like a current. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating in her chest. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The figure began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into tendrils of shadow. Its voice lingered, echoing faintly. "Follow the light. Restore the veil." As the last of the figure faded, a glowing path appeared before Emily, stretching toward the towering structures. The orb in her hand pulsed in sync with the trail, urging her forward. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the path, her resolve hardening with each step. The hum intensified as she approached the largest structure. The air shimmered, and the shapes of other worlds became clearer. Emily saw glimpses of lives playing out in these alternate realities. A woman walking her dog in a sunlit park, a child flying a kite in a golden field, a man staring out at a stormy sea. But darker visions emerged too. Shadows creeping through abandoned streets, flames consuming cities, faces twisted in terror. Emily gripped the orb tightly. "I have to fix this," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Reaching the base of the largest tower, she saw a circular opening glowing with the same blue light. The hum crescendoed into a deafening roar, and the energy in the air crackled like a storm. Without hesitation, Emily stepped inside. The chamber was vast and empty, its walls pulsating with the same eerie glow. At its center stood a pedestal etched with intricate, shifting patterns. The orb seemed to pull her toward it. She placed the orb on the pedestal. The room erupted with light and sound, shadows and energy swirling together in a chaotic storm. Emily fell to her knees, shielding her eyes as the roar reached its peak. Then silence. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the hospital. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, and distant voices drifted through the air. She was lying on the MRI bed, the technician standing beside her, looking concerned. "Miss Foster? Are you all right? The scan's over." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. The hospital was bustling again, alive with normalcy. She sat up slowly, her hands trembling. I think so, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But when she looked down, she saw it, a faint blue glow pulsing beneath her skin. Chapter 6, A Glimpse of the Unknown. Emily sat motionless on the MRI bed, staring at the faint blue glow beneath her skin. The technician frowned, his concern deepening. Miss Foster, are you sure you're okay? You look pale. Emily forced a nod, her mouth dry. I'm fine. Just lightheaded. Well, take your time getting up. These scans can sometimes leave you feeling a bit off, he said, stepping aside to jot notes on his clipboard. Emily slid off the bed, her legs shaky but functional. She clenched her fists, trying to hide the glow from view. It dimmed slightly but remained present, an unrelenting reminder of whatever had just happened. She needed answers, but this wasn't the place. Thank you, she said, forcing a smile as she walked briskly toward the exit. The hospital was alive with its usual rhythms, patients and staff bustling through the halls, the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. It was as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. Emily reached her car and locked herself inside, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse racing. What she'd experienced couldn't be real. Could it? The shadow, the orb, the fractures, it all felt like a vivid nightmare. But the glow beneath her skin was undeniable. Pull it together, she muttered, starting the engine. The car's familiar hum grounded her as she navigated the streets back to her flat. Once home, Emily bolted the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest heaving. The comforting clutter of her small apartment surrounded her. Books stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, an unfinished cup of tea on the counter, a pile of laundry she'd been avoiding. It all felt distant, irrelevant. She walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. The glow was faint under her sweater, but when she pushed up her sleeve, it blazed brighter, radiating from her forearm. The sight made her stomach churn. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. The glow pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Tentatively, she pressed her fingers to it. A jolt of energy shot up her arm, and for a brief moment her vision blurred. Images flashed before her eyes. The shadowy figure, the shifting towers, and countless faces, some human, others unrecognizable. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of the sink. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. Whatever this was, it was connected to the fractures, and to her. Emily sank to the floor, her back against the cool tiles. She needed help, but who could she trust with something like this? The police would think she was insane. Doctors might run tests, but what could they possibly find? She was alone in this. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint hum, barely audible but persistent. She looked around, her skin prickling. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her. The glow on her arm intensified and the hum grew louder. Emily scrambled to her feet, backing away from the sink. The bathroom mirror began to ripple, its surface distorting like water disturbed by a pebble. Her reflection dissolved, replaced by the shadowy figure from the in-between. "No," she gasped, pressing herself against the wall. The figure's voice echoed in her mind, calm but insistent. "The veil is fragile. The fractures spread." Emily shook her head, her voice rising. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" "You must seal them," the figure said. "The orb has chosen you. There is no turning back." The mirror returned to normal, the shadow vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The hum faded, leaving Emily in silence once more. Her legs gave out and she slid to the floor, her body trembling. "Seal the fractures?" The words echoed in her mind. How could she, an ordinary woman, possibly take on such an impossible task? She didn't even know where to start. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her. Crawling to her feet, she grabbed it, half expecting another glitch or sign of the surreal. But the screen displayed a text message from an unknown number. "Follow the light. Trust the orb." Emily's grip tightened on the phone. Her hands trembled as she stared at the message. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone or something was guiding her, and she had no choice but to follow. She grabbed her jacket and keys, her resolve hardening. If the fractures were real, then she needed to understand them. And if the orb had chosen her, she would find out why. The hum returned, faint but unmistakable, as she stepped out into the night. The streetlights flickered above her, and the glow beneath her skin pulsed in time with their rhythm. For better or worse, her journey had begun. Chapter 7. A Guiding Light. The night air was crisp, biting against Emily's cheeks as she stepped onto the deserted street. The hum beneath her skin, faint yet insistent, seemed to pull her forward. The glowing orb in her arm pulsed steadily, its rhythm syncing with her quickened heartbeat. "Follow the light," she murmured, the cryptic message repeating in her mind. But what light? The street lamps above flickered weakly, casting uneven pools of illumination. No beacon or path presented itself. As she walked aimlessly, her unease grew. The city, usually alive with late-night activity, felt unnaturally still. Cars lined the curbs, but no engines ran, no pedestrians passed, and no voices echoed. It was as though she had slipped into a parallel world, a hollow version of her own. The orb pulsed brighter, tugging at her senses. She stopped, glancing down an alley to her left. The shadows there seemed darker, heavier, yet something about it drew her in. She hesitated, her instincts screaming against venturing further into the unknown. "Trust the orb," the message had said. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the alley. The hum grew louder, resonating through her chest. The glow beneath her skin illuminated the narrow passage, casting eerie reflections on the damp brick walls. The alley ended at a tall iron gate, its intricate latticework entwined with rusted chains. Beyond it, she saw the faint flicker of blue light. Emily pushed against the gate, but it held firm. The orb pulsed sharply, sending a jolt through her arm. She recoiled, and as her hand left the gate, the chains dissolved into a fine mist, leaving the path clear. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is definitely not normal." She stepped through, entering a courtyard surrounded by abandoned buildings. The blue light she had seen earlier now shone brightly at the center, swirling and shifting like a miniature galaxy suspended in the air. It was mesmerizing, and Emily felt an overwhelming urge to approach. As she neared, the light expanded, taking shape. It formed into a doorway, a shimmering portal framed by shifting energy. The hum in her chest intensified, urging her forward. She hesitated, fear gripping her. "What's on the other side?" she asked aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer came, but the orb pulsed insistently. Gritting her teeth, she stepped into the light. The world shifted around her, a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds that overwhelmed her senses. When it settled, Emily found herself standing in a barren wasteland. The sky above was a swirling mass of gray and black clouds, lightning flashing intermittently. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and dry, the air thick with the acrid scent of ozone. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the desolation. In the distance, towering structures like the ones she had seen in the in-between stretched toward the churning sky. They radiated an ominous energy, their surfaces rippling as though alive. "This can't be real," she murmured, hugging herself against the cold. But the pulsing orb reminded her otherwise. A movement caught her eye. Across the cracked earth, a figure emerged, cloaked in shadow. It was humanoid, yet its form shifted unnaturally, its edges blurring and reforming with every step. Emily's heart pounded as the figure approached. "Who are you?" she called, her voice echoing in the stillness. The figure stopped a few paces away. Though it had no face, she felt its gaze piercing into her. Its voice, deep and resonant, echoed in her mind. "You carry the key," it said. "The fractures must be sealed." Emily clenched her fists, anger flaring. "Why me? I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't ask for any of this." The figure tilted its head, its form flickering. "The orb chose you because you are unbound by the constraints of your world. You see beyond what others cannot." "That's not an answer," she snapped. "How am I supposed to seal these fractures? What do I do?" The figure extended a hand, and a faint glow appeared in the distance. It was another portal, similar to the one she had just stepped through. "Each fracture leads to a world at risk," the figure said. "Follow the orb's guidance. Restore the balance." Before Emily could protest further, the figure dissolved, its shadowy form scattering like ash on the wind. The wasteland grew eerily silent once more. She turned toward the glowing portal, her frustration simmering beneath her fear. The orb in her arm pulsed steadily, urging her forward. With no other choice, she began to walk, her steps crunching on the brittle ground. As she neared the portal, she felt the weight of the task ahead pressing on her. Each step felt heavier, the enormity of her responsibility sinking in. She didn't know what lay beyond the portal, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back. Chapter 8. A World on the Brink. Emily stepped through the portal, her body enveloped by a surge of energy that left her breathless. When she emerged on the other side, the air was warm and heavy, carrying the tang of salt and the faint hum of distant machinery. She stood on the edge of a crumbling city. Skyscrapers tilted precariously, their steel skeletons exposed. The ground beneath her feet was scorched, cracked with veins of molten orange that glowed faintly in the dim light of an overcast sky. Above, the clouds churned with an unnatural green hue, swirling like a brewing storm. The orb in her arm pulsed urgently, directing her attention to the horizon. There, a massive fracture split the sky, a jagged glowing rift that stretched from the heavens to the earth. The edges of the fracture rippled, bleeding light and shadow that seemed to twist reality itself. Emily's stomach churned at the sight. "This is insane," she whispered. But the orb pulsed again, urging her forward. The ground shifted under her feet as she began to walk, the heat radiating from the cracks searing through her shoes. The city loomed ahead, its ruins stark against the distorted sky. As she approached, she noticed movement, a flicker of shadows darting between the wreckage. Her pulse quickened. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing off the hollow shells of buildings. The shadows stilled. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure emerge, a man, his face gaunt and his clothes tattered. He carried a makeshift spear, its tip fashioned from jagged metal. His eyes widened when they met hers. "You're real," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "You're alive?" Emily nodded, her unease growing. "Yes. Who are you? What happened here?" The man lowered his spear slightly, though his grip remained tight. "Name's Kale. This place, it's falling apart. The rift's been spreading for months. Everything it touches changes. Breaks." Emily glanced at the fracture, its light pulsating with a chaotic rhythm. "Why haven't you left?" Kale laughed bitterly. "Left? There's nowhere to go. The rift follows. It swallows everything." The weight of his words settled over her. This wasn't just a fracture. It was a world-ending tear in reality. And somehow, she was supposed to fix it. "The orb," she said aloud, more to herself than to him. "What did you say?" Kale asked, his eyes narrowing. Emily hesitated, then pushed up her sleeve to reveal the faint glow on her forearm. "I have something that might help." Kale's expression shifted, a mixture of awe and fear. "You're the one they talked about," he said, his voice trembling. "The healer, the one who can seal it." "I don't even know how," Emily admitted. "I was just told to follow this." She gestured toward the fracture, and the orb pulsed again, brighter this time. The light seemed to resonate with the rift, drawing an almost imperceptible response, a flicker in its chaotic rhythm. Kale took a step back. "If you're going to do something, you'd better do it fast. The rift's growing. It's already consumed half the city." Emily's heart raced as she turned toward the fracture. The orb in her arm pulsed faster, urging her forward. "What happens if it's not sealed?" Kale's face darkened. "Then we all fall into it, or become something else." A shiver ran through her. She didn't want to ask what he meant by something else. Instead, she focused on the rift. The air around it warped, the light bending in impossible patterns. Her instincts screamed to stay away, but the orb guided her closer. As she neared, the ground quaked. Debris tumbled from the skeletal remains of buildings, and the heat intensified. Emily shielded her eyes as she approached the base of the fracture. The energy radiating from it was overwhelming, a chaotic symphony of light and sound that threatened to pull her apart. "What now?" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. The orb pulsed violently, and the glow beneath her skin spread, enveloping her entire arm. She raised her hand instinctively, and a beam of blue light shot toward the fracture. The energy collided with the rift, and the ground shook violently. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the edges of the fracture began to stabilize, the chaotic ripples smoothing into clean, sharp lines. The light dimmed slightly, and the overwhelming hum softened. Emily gritted her teeth, focusing every ounce of her will into the orb. The energy flowing through her was unlike anything she had ever experienced, pure, raw power that both terrified and exhilarated her. The fracture resisted, its edges flaring violently as if fighting back. "You've got this," she muttered to herself, her voice strained. "You have to." With a final surge, the orb's light intensified, and the fracture began to close. The jagged edges folded inward, the rift shrinking until it was nothing more than a faint shimmer in the air. When it disappeared entirely, the silence that followed was deafening. Emily collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving. The glow on her arm faded, leaving only a faint warmth beneath her skin. She glanced at Cale, who stood frozen, his spear dangling loosely in his hand. You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded weakly, her body trembling from the effort. But before she could respond, the orb pulsed again, faint but insistent. Another fracture awaited. Chapter 9. A Growing Purpose. Emily leaned against the cracked pavement, her body aching from the strain of sealing the fracture. The orb's faint glow steadied, a quiet reminder that her task was far from over. She glanced at Cale, who still stared at her, awe and disbelief etched on his weathered face. "Is it always like this?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Cale knelt beside her, offering a hand to help her stand. "I wouldn't know. You're the first to fight back against it." His voice held a hint of hope, fragile but undeniable. "But if you can do it once, maybe you can stop the rest." The weight of his words pressed heavily on her. She barely knew what she was doing. Yet here she was, holding the fate of an entire world, perhaps many worlds, in her hands. "I need to keep moving," she said, forcing herself upright despite the protests of her muscles. The orb pulsed faintly, urging her forward. "The fractures aren't going to wait," Cale frowned. "You're going alone? Do I have a choice?" Emily asked, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The rift might have been sealed, but the damage left behind was evident in every crumbling building, every fissure in the ground. The air still felt heavy, charged with residual energy. She could feel it calling to her, pulling her toward the next fracture. "You'll need supplies," Cale said after a pause. "Water, food, weapons, maybe." Emily shook her head. "I don't think weapons are going to help with whatever this is." She held up her arm, the faint glow beneath her skin catching his attention. "This is all I've got." Cale's expression hardened. "Then let me at least guide you to the edge of the city. Beyond that, it's all wasteland." She hesitated but nodded. "Okay, let's go." The journey through the ruined city was eerily quiet. Every step echoed, the sound amplified by the hollow shells of buildings. Occasionally, a gust of wind would scatter debris, making Emily jump. Cale led the way, his movements deliberate and practiced, as though he had navigated these streets countless times. "Were there others?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Cale didn't look back. "Once, families, scavengers, people trying to hold on, but the rift, it took them." She shivered, remembering the chaotic energy of the fracture and the shadows she'd seen darting in the corners of her vision. What did it turn them into? "Nothing human," Cale said grimly. "I don't know what they are, but they're dangerous. They hunt anyone who's left." Emily glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see one of these creatures lurking in the shadows. "Why did you stay?" Cale stopped and turned to face her. "Because running doesn't help, it follows. Staying here, at least I knew what I was up against." His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes. Emily nodded and followed him in silence. They reached the edge of the city as the gray sky began to darken. The buildings gave way to barren fields, the ground cracked and lifeless. In the distance, a faint glow shimmered, the unmistakable sign of another fracture. "This is where I stop," Cale said, his voice firm. "The wasteland isn't safe, even for you." Emily stared at the distant glow, her chest tightening. "Thank you," she said, turning back to him, "for guiding me." Cale hesitated, then handed her a small canteen. "Take this. You'll need it." She accepted it with a small smile. "You could come with me, you know. You don't have to stay here." He shook his head. "This is my home, broken or not, but you've got a chance to fix things." His words settled over her like a heavy mantle. She nodded, gripping the canteen tightly. "Take care of yourself." "You too," he said, stepping back. "And good luck." With that, Emily turned toward the wasteland, the orb's faint pulse guiding her steps. The fractured light ahead seemed to grow brighter, beckoning her forward. She walked into the desolation, the air thick with heat and tension. As the distance between her and the city grew, so did her resolve. The orb pulsed steadily, a reminder of her purpose. She didn't know how many fractures there were or how long she could keep going. But one thing was clear. She couldn't stop now. Chapter 10. Into the Wasteland. The wasteland stretched endlessly before Emily, a barren expanse of cracked earth and jagged rock. The heat radiating from the ground distorted the horizon, creating rippling mirages that made the distant fracture shimmer like a ghostly flame. Every step felt heavier, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of her boots on the scorched soil. The orb's glow remained steady, a faint beacon in the encroaching darkness. It pulsed with a rhythm she couldn't ignore, guiding her steps like an unspoken command. The fracture loomed closer, its chaotic light flickering against the green-tinted sky. Hours passed, or so it seemed. The monotony of the wasteland played tricks on her perception, each step blending into the next. Exhaustion began to creep in, her body aching from the relentless march. She paused to take a sip from the canteen Kale had given her, the water cool and refreshing against her parched throat. As she lowered the canteen, a faint sound reached her ears, a distant, rhythmic tapping. Her breath caught as she turned toward the source. At first, she saw nothing but the desolate landscape. Then, on the edge of her vision, a shadow moved. Emily's heart pounded as she reached instinctively for something, anything, to defend herself. Her fingers closed around a jagged rock, its rough edges biting into her palm. She stepped back, scanning the horizon for more movement. The tapping grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. From behind a rocky outcrop, a figure emerged. It wasn't human. The creature stood hunched, its limbs elongated and twisted unnaturally. Its skin was pale and cracked, like the earth beneath Emily's feet. Empty sockets stared where eyes should have been, and its jaw hung open, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, its clawed hands dragging against the ground. Emily froze, her grip tightening on the rock. The creature's head tilted toward her, as if sensing her presence. It let out a low growl, then began to lurch forward, each step quickening as it closed the distance. Adrenaline surged through Emily's veins. She turned and ran, the creature's guttural snarls growing louder behind her. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, and she stumbled more than once, catching herself just in time. The fracture's glow grew brighter ahead, its chaotic energy casting eerie shadows on the wasteland. The orb pulsed violently, urging her onward. She could feel its energy coursing through her arm, a tingling heat that spread to her chest. The fracture was close now, its jagged edges cutting through the sky like a wound. She didn't have time to think, only to act. Reaching the base of the fracture, Emily turned to face her pursuer. The creature had stopped a few paces away, its movements hesitant. It snarled, clawing at the air as though something invisible held it back. The orb pulsed brighter, its glow spreading across her arm and into her chest. Emily raised her hand instinctively, the light intensifying as it connected with the fracture. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek, its body contorting violently before it crumbled to the ground, lifeless. Emily didn't have time to process what had just happened. The fracture began to ripple, its chaotic energy growing unstable. She focused on the orb, channeling its light toward the rift. The hum returned, louder this time, resonating through her entire body. The fracture resisted, its jagged edges flaring with bursts of light and shadow. Emily gritted her teeth, pouring every ounce of her will into the orb. The energy surged outward, colliding with the rift in a brilliant explosion of light. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a final deafening crack, the fracture sealed. The chaos subsided, leaving behind a faint shimmer in the air. Emily collapsed to her knees, her body trembling from the effort. The wasteland was silent once more, the oppressive heat replaced by a cool breeze. She glanced at the creature's lifeless form, a pang of sadness piercing her exhaustion. Whatever it had been, it was no longer a threat. The orb's glow dimmed, but its pulse remained steady. Emily knew what it meant. There were more fractures, more worlds in need of her. She stood, her legs shaky but determined. The wasteland stretched endlessly ahead, but the faint glow of another fracture shimmered on the horizon. Emily took a deep breath and began walking. Chapter 11. Allies in the Abyss. The wasteland seemed endless, an oppressive expanse of cracked earth and barren rock that offered no sign of respite. Emily trudged forward, her body aching with exhaustion. The orb's pulse remained steady, a quiet rhythm that urged her onward toward the faint glow of the next fracture in the distance. As she walked, her thoughts churned. Each sealed fracture felt like a small victory, but the enormity of her task weighed heavily on her. How many more worlds were on the brink? How long could she keep going before the strain overwhelmed her? A faint noise interrupted her thoughts. She stopped, straining to listen. It was subtle at first, like the distant murmur of voices carried on the wind. Her pulse quickened. Could it be another creature like the one she'd faced? Or dare she hope, someone else like Kale? The voices grew clearer, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps. Emily ducked behind a jagged rock, peering out cautiously. Two figures emerged over a ridge, silhouetted against the distorted sky. One was tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a large pack. The other was smaller, their movements quick and purposeful. Emily hesitated, unsure whether to reveal herself. The last time she'd encountered strangers, it had been a mixed blessing, but the wasteland offered few opportunities for connection, and she couldn't afford to let fear guide her. She stepped out from behind the rock, raising her hands in what she hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Hey!" The figures stopped abruptly, their voices silenced. The taller one drew a weapon, a makeshift club fashioned from scrap metal. The smaller figure crouched slightly, as if preparing to flee or fight. "I'm not here to hurt you," Emily called, keeping her distance. "I'm just passing through." The taller figure stepped forward cautiously. As they came closer, Emily could make out their features. A man in his late 30s, his face weathered and lined. His companion was a young woman, barely out of her teens, her eyes sharp and wary. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice rough but steady. "My name's Emily," she said, lowering her hands. "I'm trying to reach the fractures." The man's grip on his club tightened. "You're heading toward them? Are you insane?" The younger woman nudged his arm. "Wait, Rafe. Look at her arm." Emily glanced down and realized the faint glow of the orb was visible through her sleeve. Rafe's eyes narrowed, his expression hard to read. "You're one of them," he said. "A sealer." "A what?" Emily asked, startled. The young woman stepped forward, her expression softening. "The people who can close the rifts. We've heard stories about you. You're the only ones who can stop all this." Emily blinked, taken aback. "There are others like me?" Rafe shrugged. "There were. Most of them didn't make it." The weight of his words hit her like a blow. She wasn't alone in this fight, but the odds were grim. Still, the thought of others, people who understood what she was going through, offered a small measure of comfort. "I've sealed 2 fractures so far," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't know how I'm doing it, but the orb, it guides me." Rafe studied her for a moment, then lowered his weapon. "If you've made it this far, you've got more guts than most. But the next fracture, it's worse than anything you've seen." The younger woman nodded. "We were scouting it when we saw you. The rift is huge, and there are things guarding it." Emily's stomach churned. "What kind of things?" "Shadows," Rafe said grimly. "Twisted creatures born from the rift. They hunt anyone who gets close." A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to stay composed. "Then I'll need help." Rafe exchanged a glance with the young woman, who nodded. "We'll take you there," he said. "But after that, you're on your own." "That's all I can ask," Emily replied, her voice firm. The journey to the fracture was grueling. The terrain grew harsher, the ground fractured by jagged fissures that glowed faintly with an ominous light. The air grew thick, each breath a struggle. Emily followed Rafe and his companion, who introduced herself as Naya, grateful for their guidance. As they crested a ridge, the fracture came into view. It was massive, a jagged tear in reality that stretched across the horizon. The air around it rippled with chaotic energy, and dark shapes moved within the glow. Naya pointed to the base of the rift. "That's where you need to go. But those things," she shuddered, "they'll come for you." Emily tightened her grip on the orb, its warmth spreading through her hand. "I'll deal with them." Rafe placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're braver than most. Just don't die out there." Emily managed a faint smile. "I'll do my best." As she descended toward the fracture, the shadows within the rift began to stir. The creatures emerged one by one, their twisted forms writhing as they moved toward her. Emily's heart pounded, but the orb pulsed stronger, filling her with a strange, steely resolve. The fracture's chaotic energy flared, and the creatures charged. Emily raised her arm, the orb's light blazing as she stepped into the fray. Chapter 12, Battle at the Fracture. The air around the fracture crackled with volatile energy, a storm of light and shadow colliding in chaotic bursts. Emily stepped forward, the orb in her arm glowing fiercely, casting a bluish halo around her. The twisted creatures that had emerged from the rift moved with unnerving speed, their grotesque forms flickering as though caught between reality and some other plane. Her first instinct was to run, but the orb pulsed sharply, anchoring her in place. The light surged, spreading warmth through her arm and filling her with a strange, unfamiliar confidence. I can do this, she told herself, gripping the thought tightly as the first creature lunged. Its elongated limbs slashed through the air, the jagged tips glinting in the eerie light. Emily raised her arm instinctively, and the orb released a burst of energy. The creature shrieked as the light struck it, its form writhing and dissolving into black smoke. She barely had time to react before another attacked, followed by a third. Each was faster, more relentless than the last. Emily ducked and dodged, her movements clumsy but effective. The orb flared again, emitting a shield-like barrier that repelled the closest creature, sending it skittering back. Nia's voice echoed faintly from the ridge. Keep going, you're holding them off. Emily risked a glance upward. Nia and Rafe stood silhouetted against the horizon, their figures small but steady. The sight grounded her, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. The fracture pulsed violently, drawing her focus back. The rift seemed to respond to her presence, its jagged edges rippling as if alive. More creatures emerged, their snarls piercing the air. Emily's breathing quickened. The orb's glow intensified, and she realized what she needed to do. I can't just fight them, I have to seal it. She pushed forward, weaving through the onslaught of creatures. Her movements became more deliberate, the orb guiding her as she deflected attacks and struck down enemies. The closer she got to the fracture, the more the air buzzed with energy, a suffocating force pressing against her. Finally, she reached the base of the rift. The ground beneath her feet was unstable, cracking and shifting as the rift's energy surged. Emily raised her arm, the orb's light shining brighter than ever. The creatures recoiled, their shrieks rising in a discordant chorus. They circled her, hesitant but unwilling to retreat entirely. The fracture's glow flickered, its chaotic rhythm faltering. Emily closed her eyes, focusing on the orb. She didn't know how she knew what to do, but the knowledge felt ingrained, instinctual. She channeled her will into the orb, pouring every ounce of her determination into its light. The energy surged outward, connecting with the fracture in a blinding flash. The rift fought back. Waves of energy rippled through the air, pushing against her, threatening to overwhelm her. Emily gritted her teeth, digging her heels into the unstable ground. The orb pulsed in response, its light growing stronger, more focused. The creatures shrieked louder, their forms distorting as the rift began to shrink. One by one, they dissolved, their bodies unraveling into smoke and ash. The fracture's chaotic energy dimmed, its jagged edges folding inward. With a final, deafening crack, the rift sealed. The oppressive energy vanished, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. The orb's glow softened, its pulse steady but subdued. Emily collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, the adrenaline draining from her system. The ground beneath her was solid once more, the eerie glow of the wasteland fading into a muted stillness. She looked up at the ridge. Naya and Rafe were running toward her, their figures blurred by her tears of relief. You did it, Naya exclaimed as she reached Emily, dropping to her knees beside her. I can't believe it. You actually did it. Rafe knelt on Emily's other side, his expression a mix of awe and concern. Are you all right? Emily nodded weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. I think so. Rafe glanced at the now sealed fracture. That was incredible. But how much more of this can you handle? Emily looked down at the orb, its faint glow a quiet reminder of her responsibility. She didn't have an answer, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Somewhere, more fractures waited, threatening other worlds with chaos and destruction. I'll keep going, she said, her voice firmer than she felt. I don't have a choice. Rafe and Naya exchanged a glance, then nodded. We'll help you, Nia said, as much as we can. Emily managed a small, grateful smile. For the first time since this nightmare began, she didn't feel entirely alone. Chapter 13. A Fragile Alliance. The next morning brought an uneasy calm to the wasteland. Emily woke to the faint warmth of sunlight breaking through the green-tinged sky, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness she had endured near the fracture. Her body ached, and her mind reeled from the memories of the battle, but the steady pulse of the orb beneath her skin reminded her there was no time to rest. Naya and Rafe sat a few feet away, speaking in hushed tones as they sifted through their makeshift packs. When Emily stirred, Naya turned and offered her a canteen. "Drink," she said. "You'll need your strength." Emily took it gratefully, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "What's next?" she asked, her voice still rough. Rafe leaned back against a rock, his expression serious. "The fractures aren't random, they're spreading in a pattern." Emily frowned, sitting up. "What kind of pattern?" Naya reached into her pack and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Unfolding it, she revealed a rough map of the wasteland, marked with circles and lines that connected them. "The fractures we've seen so far line up with this." Emily studied the map. The circles formed a strange, spiraling shape, each fracture positioned along its edges. At the center of the spiral was an unmarked void. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the center. "We don't know," Rafe admitted. "But whatever it is, it's probably what's causing all of this." Emily's stomach tightened. The idea of confronting something powerful enough to tear apart entire worlds was almost too much to bear. But the steady pulse of the orb reminded her that she had already faced the impossible and survived. "How far is the next fracture?" she asked, forcing herself to focus. Nia traced a line on the map with her finger. "Not far. Maybe a day's walk, if we're lucky." Emily nodded. "Then we should move." The journey to the next fracture was uneventful, though the weight of their task hung heavily over the group. The wasteland's barren landscape stretched endlessly around them, the ground cracked and dry, the air thick with heat. Occasionally, Emily caught a glimpse of movement in the distance, shadows flickering at the edges of her vision, but nothing approached. Nia walked beside her, her small frame quick and agile despite the harsh terrain. "How are you holding up?" she asked, breaking the silence. Emily shrugged. "I've been better, but I've been worse." Nia smiled faintly. "You're tougher than you look." Emily glanced at her. "So are you." They walked in silence for a while, the bond between them growing subtly stronger. Despite her fear and exhaustion, Emily found comfort in Naya's presence. She had spent so much of this journey feeling isolated, and having someone to share the burden made the wasteland feel a little less overwhelming. By midday, the sky began to darken, the faint glow of the next fracture visible on the horizon. The air grew heavier, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on Emily's arms stand on end. "We're close," Rafe said, his voice low. "Stay sharp." As they approached the fracture, the terrain became more treacherous. Deep fissures cut through the ground, glowing faintly with an ominous light. The hum of the fracture grew louder, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through Emily's chest. At the base of the fracture, a cluster of shadowy creatures moved restlessly, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke. They were smaller than the ones Emily had faced before, but there were more of them, at least a dozen, maybe more. "Great," Emily muttered. More shadows. Naya crouched beside her, her eyes scanning the creatures. "They don't look as strong as the others." "Doesn't mean they'll be easy to deal with," Rafe said grimly, gripping his makeshift weapon. Emily took a deep breath, the orb pulsing steadily beneath her skin. "I'll distract them. You two stay back." "Wait," Naya said, grabbing her arm. "We can't just let you go alone." Emily met her gaze. "I don't have a choice. You've seen what the orb can do. It's the only thing that can seal the fracture." Rafe hesitated, then nodded. "We'll cover you from here, but if things go south, we're coming in." Emily didn't argue. She couldn't afford to. Turning toward the fracture, she stepped forward, the orb's light intensifying as she approached. The creatures reacted instantly, their heads snapping toward her. With a collective snarl, they surged forward, their movements erratic and frenzied. Emily raised her arm, the orb releasing a burst of light that sent the nearest creatures reeling. The battle was chaotic. Emily moved instinctively, the orb guiding her as she dodged attacks and struck back with bursts of energy. The creatures were faster than she expected, their movements unpredictable. But the orb's power was stronger, its light burning through the shadows with each strike. In the distance, she saw Rafe and Naya fighting off a smaller group of creatures, their movements coordinated and efficient. Despite the chaos, they held their ground, giving Emily the space she needed to focus on the fracture. Reaching the base of the rift, she raised her arm, the orb's light shining brighter than ever. The fracture's chaotic energy flared, resisting her efforts, but Emily didn't falter. She poured everything she had into the orb, her will driving its power forward. The rift shrank slowly, its jagged edges folding inward. The creatures let out a collective shriek, their forms dissolving into smoke as the fracture sealed with a final burst of light. Emily collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. The orb's glow dimmed, its pulse steady but subdued. The wasteland was silent once more. Rafe and Nia approached, their expressions a mix of relief and concern. "You did it," Nia said, her voice filled with awe. Emily nodded weakly. "One more down." But as she looked at the sealed fracture, a sense of unease settled over her. The fractures were growing stronger, their energy more volatile, and the pattern on the map suggested they were converging on something far worse. Chapter 14, Convergence. The wasteland was eerily quiet as Emily, Nia, and Rafe rested near the sealed fracture. The oppressive hum of the rift was gone, replaced by a silence that felt almost unnatural. Emily leaned back against a rock, her chest still heaving from the effort of sealing the fracture. The orb in her arm pulsed faintly, a reminder that their journey was far from over. Naya sat cross-legged nearby, studying the map spread out before her. "This was the 5th one we've closed," she said, tracing the lines with her finger. "And they're all leading to this." Emily followed Nia's gesture to the center of the spiral pattern. "The origin point," she murmured. "Whatever's causing the fractures." Rafe rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "It's not just the rifts. The creatures are getting stronger, more coordinated. Something's pulling the strings." Emily's stomach tightened. The thought of an intelligence behind the fractures, something deliberately unraveling worlds, made her feel even more out of her depth. She glanced at the orb, its light dim but steady. "Why me?" she wondered, not for the first time. "We should head for the center," Nia said, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. "If we don't stop this at the source, the fractures will keep spreading." Emily nodded, though her exhaustion screamed for rest. "How far is it?" Nia consulted the map again. 2 days, maybe 3, if we keep a steady pace." Rafe stood, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "Then we'd better get moving. The longer we wait, the worse it'll get." Emily pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the ache in her muscles. The orb's faint pulse seemed to strengthen as she resolved to continue. "Let's go." The journey toward the spiral's center was grueling. The wasteland grew more treacherous with every step, the ground fractured by deep fissures that glowed faintly with residual energy. The air grew heavier, charged with a tension that set Emily's nerves on edge. As they walked, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, too fleeting to be real, but persistent enough to keep her on edge. "Do you feel that?" she asked, breaking the silence. Rafe glanced over his shoulder. "Yeah, we're not alone." Nia gripped the hilt of her knife, her knuckles white. "They're out there, waiting." Emily's grip on the orb tightened. The creatures seemed to grow bolder as they neared the center, their presence more tangible. She could feel their hostility, a simmering hatred that radiated through the air. By nightfall, they reached the edge of a massive chasm. The ground dropped away into darkness, the other side barely visible in the dim light. In the distance, the glow of another fracture pulsed faintly, marking their destination. "How do we get across?" Emily asked, scanning the chasm's jagged edges. Nia pointed to a narrow bridge of rock spanning the gap. "That's our only option." Rafe frowned. "It's too exposed. If those things attack while we're crossing..." "We don't have a choice," Emily said firmly. "We'll move quickly and stay close together." The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for one person at a time. Emily led the way, her heart pounding as she stepped onto the unsteady surface. The chasm below yawned like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Halfway across, the shadows attacked. They came from the darkness, their forms writhing and flickering as they surged toward the bridge. Emily turned, raising the orb as its light flared. The creatures recoiled, shrieking, but more replaced them, their snarls echoing through the chasm. "Move," Rafe shouted, swinging his makeshift weapon at a creature that lunged toward him. The blow connected, and the shadow dissolved into smoke, but it was quickly replaced by another. Nia darted past Emily, her knife flashing as she fought off a smaller shadow. "We're sitting ducks out here." Emily gritted her teeth, the orb's energy surging through her arm. She released a burst of light, scattering the creatures closest to the bridge. "Keep going. I'll hold them off." Rafe hesitated, but Nia grabbed his arm. "She's got this. Go." The two of them sprinted toward the other side, leaving Emily alone on the bridge. The shadows closed in, their snarls louder, their movements more aggressive. Emily stood her ground, the orb's light flaring brighter with every attack. One by one, the creatures fell, their forms dissolving into smoke. But the orb's energy waned, its light dimming as exhaustion took hold. Emily's knees buckled, and for a moment she thought she wouldn't make it. "Emily, come on!" Nia's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. Emily pushed herself to her feet, her grip on the orb tightening. With a final burst of energy, she scattered the remaining shadows and sprinted toward the other side. Rafe caught her as she stumbled, his steady hands pulling her to safety. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice taut with worry. Emily nodded weakly, her chest heaving. "I'm fine." Nia knelt beside her, her expression grim. "They're getting stronger." Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. The faint glow of the fracture ahead told her everything she needed to know. The source of the chaos was close, and whatever waited for them at the center of the spiral would be worse than anything they'd faced before. Chapter 15. The Spiral's Core. The fracture glowed ominously ahead, casting long, flickering shadows over the wasteland. Emily, Nia, and Rafe stood at the edge of the chasm, their breaths misting in the air. The oppressive energy surrounding them felt heavier than ever, like an invisible weight pressing on their chests. "This is it," Rafe muttered, his voice low. "The center of the spiral." Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the rift. It was larger than any she had seen before, its jagged edges pulsating with chaotic light that bled into the darkened sky. The ground trembled faintly beneath their feet, the fracture's energy radiating outward in waves. Nia tightened her grip on her knife. "What's the plan?" Emily raised her arm, the orb glowing faintly beneath her skin. "I'll seal it." "And the creatures?" Rafe asked, scanning the area. The shadows flickered and writhed at the edges of their vision, circling like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. "They'll come," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "But we'll hold them off. We have to." Rafe hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's finish this." The ground cracked and splintered as they approached the fracture. The orb in Emily's arm pulsed stronger, its light intensifying with every step. The hum of the rift grew louder, a deafening resonance that vibrated through her entire body. As they neared the base, the shadows attacked. The creatures surged from the darkness, their twisted forms moving with terrifying speed. Rafe swung his weapon, the sharp clang of metal echoing as he struck the nearest shadow. Nia darted and weaved, her knife flashing as she slashed at their attackers. Emily raised her arm, the orb releasing a burst of light that scattered the creatures closest to her. The fracture reacted violently, its chaotic energy flaring and sending shockwaves through the ground. "You've got to hurry," Nia shouted, her voice strained as she fended off another creature. Emily didn't hesitate. She pushed forward, stepping into the blinding glow of the fracture. The energy clawed at her, pulling her in, but the orb anchored her, its light shielding her from the rift's destructive force. She raised her arm, focusing on the orb. The energy surged, connecting with the fracture in a blinding arc of light. The rift resisted, its jagged edges flaring violently, but Emily didn't falter. She poured every ounce of her will into the orb, channeling its power into the rift. The creatures shrieked louder, their forms writhing and flickering as the rift began to shrink. Emily could feel the strain, the orb's energy battling against the chaos of the fracture, her vision blurred, her body trembling under the weight of the effort. "Emily, look out!" Rafe's voice cut through the chaos. She turned just in time to see a massive shadow lunging toward her. Its form was larger and more grotesque than any she had faced before, its claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. Emily raised her arm, the orb flaring brightly, but the creature was too close. A blur of movement intercepted the shadow. Rafe slammed into it, his weapon striking true. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form collapsing into black smoke. Rafe staggered, blood dripping from a gash on his arm. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice raw. Emily gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus on the fracture. The orb pulsed violently, its light growing brighter as it fought to close the rift. The ground shook, and a deafening crack split the air as the fracture's jagged edges began to fold inward. The energy surged one last time, and then, with a blinding flash, the rift sealed. The silence that followed was deafening. The oppressive energy vanished, leaving only the faint hum of the orb. Emily collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. The ground beneath her was solid once more, the fracture's chaotic light replaced by a faint shimmer. Rafe and Naya hurried to her side. "You did it," Nia said, her voice filled with awe. Emily nodded weakly, her chest heaving. "It's done." But as she looked at the now sealed fracture, a deep unease settled over her. The orb's glow had dimmed, its pulse unsteady, and in the distance she felt it, a presence, dark and overwhelming, emanating from the center of the spiral. "This isn't over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Naya frowned. "What do you mean? The fracture's sealed." Emily shook her head. "There's something else, something stronger." Rafe's expression hardened. "Then we keep going." Emily forced herself to her feet, the orb's faint pulse steadying her resolve. The fractures may have been sealed, but the source of the chaos, the dark force at the heart of the spiral, was still waiting, and she would face it. Chapter 16, The Heart of the Spiral. The journey to the center of the spiral was unlike anything Emily had experienced. The wasteland transformed as they pressed forward. Jagged rock formations jutted from the ground at impossible angles, and the sky darkened into a swirling vortex of shadow and light. The orb in Emily's arm pulsed weakly, its glow dimming with every step as if warning her of the danger ahead. "This place feels wrong," Naya murmured, her voice barely audible over the low hum that filled the air. Emily glanced at her, then at Rafe, who was gripping his weapon tightly. "We're close," Emily said, though the words felt hollow. She could feel the presence now, dark and oppressive, pressing against her mind like a storm cloud ready to burst. The ground trembled beneath their feet, cracks snaking across the surface as the energy from the spiral's core pulsed outward. The fractures they had sealed were only echoes of this, the source of the chaos that had torn worlds apart. When they crested the final ridge, Emily stopped in her tracks. Below them lay the heart of the spiral, a massive, swirling void of light and shadow that twisted and writhed like a living thing. It radiated power, a chaotic storm that warped the very fabric of reality around it. Naya gasped. What is that?" Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "The source." Rafe stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "How do we stop it?" Before Emily could answer, the void pulsed violently, and shadows emerged from its depths. These creatures were unlike the ones they had faced before. Larger, more defined, their forms crackling with chaotic energy. They moved with purpose, their glowing eyes fixed on Emily. "They know we're here," she said, raising her arm as the orb flickered to life. "Then let's give them a fight," Rafe growled, stepping in front of her. The battle was immediate and ferocious. The creatures descended on them with terrifying speed, their snarls echoing across the barren landscape. Rafe swung his weapon with precision, each strike sending ripples of energy through the shadows. Nia darted and weaved, her knife slashing at the creature's limbs as she moved with practiced agility. Emily stood at the edge of the chaos, the orb's light flaring as she directed bursts of energy at the attackers. Each pulse struck true, dissolving the shadows into smoke, but for every creature that fell, another emerged from the void. "We can't keep this up," Nia shouted, dodging a clawed swipe from a particularly large shadow. Emily's heart raced as she scanned the battlefield. The void pulsed again, its chaotic energy surging outward and sending shockwaves through the ground. She stumbled, the orb's glow dimming as exhaustion clawed at her. The presence from the void grew stronger, pressing against her mind. It wasn't just chaos, it was intelligent, aware. Emily could feel its malice, its hunger. This wasn't just a force, it was something alive. The realization hit her like a blow. It's not just a source, it's a being. Rafe struck down another creature, his breathing labored. "What are you saying?" "It's alive," Emily said, her voice trembling. The void, it's sentient. Naya glanced at her, fear flashing in her eyes, and it knows we're trying to stop it. The ground beneath them shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. From the center of the void, a massive figure began to emerge. Its form was incomprehensible, shifting and flickering between shapes, a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and light. Its eyes burned like twin suns, locking onto Emily. The oppressive presence in her mind intensified, a cacophony of whispers that threatened to overwhelm her. She clutched her head, falling to her knees as the orb's light flickered dangerously. Emily, Naya's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and desperate. Emily forced herself to look up. The figure loomed above them, its form towering and terrible. The void itself seemed to ripple in response to its presence, the storm of chaos intensifying. The orb pulsed weakly, its light barely visible. Emily's heart sank. The power she had relied on felt insufficient against the overwhelming force before her. Rafe and Naya moved to stand beside her, their faces grim but resolute. "We're with you," Rafe said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she raised her arm. The orb flickered, its light sputtering as it struggled to reignite. The presence from the void pressed harder, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You can't win," the voice hissed, resonating in her mind. "This world, and all others, will fall." Emily gritted her teeth, the weight of the words threatening to crush her. But as the orb pulsed faintly, she felt something else. A spark of defiance, a flicker of hope. "I won't let you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't care how strong you are. I won't let you destroy everything." The orb flared, its light surging outward in a sudden burst. The oppressive whispers recoiled, and for a moment the presence hesitated. Emily seized the opportunity, channeling every ounce of her will into the orb. The light intensified, pushing back against the void's chaotic energy. The ground quaked, the air crackling with power as the void's figure roared in fury. Emily stood firm, the orb blazing brighter as it connected with the heart of the spiral. The void resisted, its energy clashing violently with the orb's light. Emily's body shook under the strain, her vision blurring as the battle raged. But she refused to back down, her resolve hardening with every second. "Now!" she screamed, her voice echoing across the battlefield. The orb released a final, blinding surge of energy, colliding with the void in a cataclysmic burst. The ground buckled, the air filled with a deafening roar as the void's form began to unravel. Its screams reverberated through the wasteland, a sound of pure rage and despair, and then silence. When Emily opened her eyes, the void was gone. The wasteland was still, the air clear and quiet. The orb in her arm pulsed faintly, its light dim but steady. Rafe and Nia knelt beside her, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. "You did it," Nia said softly. "It's over." Emily nodded weakly, a faint smile on her lips. The fractures were sealed, and the chaos had been vanquished. But as she looked at the faint shimmer where the void had been, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't truly over. For now, though, the world was safe. Epilogue: A New Dawn. The wasteland was unrecognizable. Where once jagged cracks and barren desolation had stretched endlessly, green shoots of grass now sprouted, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. The oppressive hum of chaos had been replaced by a serene silence, broken only by the soft rustle of a gentle breeze. Emily stood on a low hill overlooking the transformed landscape, the faint glow of the orb in her arm a steady presence. She wasn't sure how long had passed since the battle at the void's core. Minutes, hours, or perhaps even days. Time felt malleable here, as though it had been warped by the chaos and was now slowly finding its rhythm again. Beside her, Nia and Rafe stood quietly, their faces etched with a mix of exhaustion and awe. They had all come through something unimaginable, and now, standing together, they could finally see the fruits of their struggle. "It's beautiful," Nia said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Emily nodded, though her thoughts were far away. The orb's light had dimmed significantly, its pulse slower now, more subdued. Whatever power it had wielded seemed spent, though Emily could still feel its quiet presence, a reminder of what they had achieved and what they had lost. Rafe broke the silence. "What happens now?" Emily let the question hang in the air, the enormity of it settling over them. She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "We rebuild. This world has a chance now. It's up to the people here to make the most of it. And you, Naya asked, her gaze steady, what will you do? Emily looked down at the orb, its faint glow reflecting in her eyes. I don't think my journey is over, she said quietly. The fractures may be sealed, but I can't shake the feeling that something bigger is out there. This might have just been the beginning. Rafe frowned. You mean there could be more voids? More worlds at risk? Emily nodded. The void felt connected, not just to this world, but to others. If it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. Naya's brow furrowed. And you're going to stop it? Emily gave a small, weary smile. If I can. I don't know how or where to start, but I'll figure it out. The orb will guide me. Rafe rested a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but warm. You're stronger than you realize. If anyone can do it, it's you. Emily felt a surge of gratitude, her chest tightening. For so long, she had felt alone in this fight. But now, standing with Nia and Rafe, she realized she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Connection. A family forged in fire. I won't forget either of you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Nia smiled faintly. You'd better not. And if you ever need backup, well, you know where to find us. Emily nodded, her heart full. She turned back to the horizon, where the first rays of dawn broke through the darkened sky. The light spread slowly, illuminating the landscape and casting away the shadows that had once plagued it. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped forward, the orb's faint glow lighting her path. She didn't know where her journey would lead her, or what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet certainty. She wasn't running anymore. She was moving forward, and she was ready.